If you were born between 1980 and 1984, your childhood had a specific quality that nothing made since has been able to replicate. You played outside until the streetlights came on. You came home when someone's mother opened a door and called your name down the street. You spent entire summers in a state of genuine boredom, building things, riding bikes, making up games with no rules and no supervision and no one tracking where you were. You watched He-Man and Transformers on Saturday mornings you woke up for. VHS tapes you had to rewind before returning. Oregon Trail on the Apple computer in your school library. 3 minutes of gameplay and then dysentery again. You made mixtapes by holding a cassette recorder up to the radio and staying completely still. You memorized your friends' phone numbers because there was no other way. No internet, no cell phone. No cable news running as background noise in every room. The world was whatever was directly in front of you, your street, your school, your neighborhood, and it was quiet in a way no generation born after you will ever fully understand. And then you turned 17, 18, 20, and the world changed into something else entirely. You were 17 to 21 years old on September 11th, 2001, old enough to understand everything. Young enough that it didn't just change how you saw the world, it changed the world you were standing in the middle of trying to build. The future you had been assembling, the sense of what adult life was supposed to look like, the model you'd been working from your whole life, all of it recalibrated in a single morning. 7 years later, you were 24 to 28 years old when the financial system collapsed. Peak career building years. The exact window when professional foundations are supposed to be laid, and the floor came out. You are the generation with the most protected childhood and the most disrupted adulthood. And psychology has something very specific to say about what that combination does to a person. There are millennials who were old enough to carry adult responsibilities when the world shifted. There are millennials who were young enough that the disruptions of the early 2000s became background noise of childhood. The early 80s babies, born between 1980 and 1984, hit those disruptions at the precise developmental moment where they did the most specific kind of work. You graduated high school between 1998 and 2002. You entered college or started your adult life at the exact turn of the millennium, shaped by a decade of optimism. The dot-com boom, the peace dividend, the broad cultural sense that things were going to keep getting better. You had a complete, detailed picture of what adult life was going to look like. You had been building toward it your whole childhood, and then you were old enough to watch all of it change at once. Developmental psychologists study something called adversity timing, the principle that the same external event produces fundamentally different psychological effects, depending on the developmental stage a person occupies when it occurs. A child who experiences major disruption absorbs it differently than an adolescent. An adolescent absorbs it differently than a young adult. And a young adult, between 17 and 25, in the process of constructing their first independent identity and model of the world, is in the most psychologically formative position of all, because disruption at that stage does not just affect circumstances, it restructures the framework being built. The early 80s babies experienced two of the most significant ruptures of the modern era at precisely this window, back to back. First, the world became less safe than they had been raised to believe. Then, the economic foundation they were building on became less solid than they had been promised. But here is what separates this cohort psychologically from the younger millennials who went through the same events at different developmental ages. They had a fully intact childhood first. Their foundational years, from birth to roughly 16, unfolded in the most stable, pre-digital, pre-24-hour news cycle environment that any cohort born in the 80s would experience. Their core psychology was assembled on solid ground, and then the ground changed. What that sequence produces, protected formation followed by concentrated adult adversity, is not damage without return. It is a very specific kind of resilience, one built on a foundation solid enough to absorb impact without losing its shape entirely. In 2002, researchers Robin Silver, Allison Holman, and colleagues published a landmark longitudinal study in JAMA tracking psychological responses across all age groups in the months and years following September 11th. The study, conducted with a nationally representative sample of over 2,700 Americans, found something striking about where the psychological impact landed deepest. Young adults, people in their late teens and early 20s at the time of the attacks, showed the most persistent patterns of psychological processing in the years that followed. Not because they were the most fragile, because they were at the specific developmental stage where world-altering events do not just create memories, they become structural. They reset the model of reality a person has been building. For the 1980 to 1984 cohort, September 11th arrived between ages 17 and 21, the exact window developmental psychologist Jeffrey Arnett identified as emerging adulthood. The period when a person's fundamental relationship to the world, their sense of safety, of possibility, of what the future looks like, is being established for the very first time as an independent adult. An event that magnitude, at that timing, does not stay on the surface. It becomes a before and after. The dividing line between the world you were formed in and the world you actually had to live in. This cohort crossed that line, and then crossed another one 7 years later, at 24 to 28, when the recession arrived during the exact years professional and financial foundations are supposed to be built. 2 ruptures, both at the wrong time, both survived. Here is what the combination, protected childhood, disrupted adulthood, actually built in you. You know what stability feels like from the inside, not as a concept, as a lived, physical childhood memory. You remember it. The summers with no agenda, the world contained within a neighborhood, the specific quality of a morning when nothing was wrong and nothing was coming. Because you remember it, you can locate it again in ways that people who grew up in already disrupted environments often cannot. You know what solid ground feels like. That knowledge becomes a compass when the ground shifts, and it has shifted for you more than once, at the worst possible times. You are also more adaptable than most people around you recognize. You made the transition from a fully analog childhood to a fully digital adulthood in real time, without a guide. You rebuilt professional foundations after a collapse that hit during your most vulnerable career years. You adjusted your model of reality multiple times, across safety, across economics, across everything the world turned out to be, and kept functioning. That is not something everyone can do. It requires a foundational stability strong enough to absorb serious disruption without collapsing. You had that foundation. It was built in backyards and Saturday mornings and summers that lasted, and it held. There is something that deserves to be said about what it costs to be the generation that clearly remembers both sides. You remember the world before the news cycle became a continuous emergency, before every pocket held a portal to everything going wrong everywhere at once, before the economic ground felt permanently temporary, before being a functional adult required carrying a background level of vigilance that previous generations never had to maintain. You remember what it felt like to not carry any of that. And you know, in your body, not just in your memory, what it took to build a life on the other side of it. The career rebuilt after the recession. The stability reconstructed after the world rearranged itself during your most critical years. The internal foundation maintained, quietly, without much credit, through disruptions that arrived precisely when you could least afford them. Early 80s babies are not the most talked about sub-cohort in the generational conversation. They don't have as many think pieces or cultural moments or sociological studies specifically assigned to their 5-year window. They are not the loudest generation in the room. They are the ones who took what the 90s gave them, the intact, uncomplicated, quiet version of childhood that no one born after them got in quite the same form, and carried it through everything that came after. Through the morning the world changed. Through the years the floor was gone. Through the version of adulthood that looked nothing like the one they had been building toward since they were kids on bikes in neighborhoods that didn't require them to know what was coming. They held both, and they kept moving. That is not a generation that was forgotten. That is a generation that did the work without waiting for someone to notice. If this described your generation more accurately than anything you've seen before, subscribe. The next video goes somewhere you are already pointed after watching this one. And if this one landed, the next one will too.